believing she was just an alien woman. I discovered she was the queen when soldiers bowed Captain Eric Carter had never been to a place as cold and intimidating as the Tzalkian Empire. The galaxy had many powerful species, but the Tzalkians were legendary for their fierce warriors and their impenetrable, towering citadels. They ruled the sector with strength and pride, and most species kept their distance. To humans, they were both a mystery and a threat. But for Eric, it was a mission, a chance to bring peace, or at least a trade agreement between the human race and the Tzalkians. As his ship, the Valor, descended toward the alien world, Eric couldn't help but notice the dark clouds swirling over the massive continent below. The planet had seen better days. Its once vibrant cities had fallen into decay, and large stretches of land were barren, the result of an environmental collapse no one seemed to understand or be able to fix. Still, the Tzalkian queen, Altharis, ruled with an iron fist, and it was her approval he sought. The air was thick with tension as Eric stepped onto the stone platform of the royal palace. The gates loomed high above him, guarded by towering Tzalkian soldiers. They were nearly 8 feet tall, with sharp, angular features and armored exoskeletons that glinted in the harsh light. Despite their intimidating appearance, they stood aside without a word as Eric approached, his hands clasped behind his back, his posture firm. He was led into the heart of the palace, where the throne room awaited. The walls were lined with ancient tapestries depicting the Tzalkian warriors in battle. At the far end of the room, on a throne of dark obsidian, sat Queen Altharis. Her piercing green eyes scanned him as he entered. There was no smile on her face, no welcoming gesture. She was regal, powerful, and deadly. Eric did not flinch. He had dealt with difficult leaders before. This, however, was different. The queen was unlike any ruler he had ever encountered. Her presence alone filled the room, a force of nature that demanded respect. "Human," she said, her voice cold and commanding. "What brings you to my empire?" Eric bowed his head slightly, acknowledging her authority. "Your Majesty, I come on behalf of the United Nations of Earth. We seek to establish trade relations with your people, to share technology and resources that could benefit both our worlds." A flicker of amusement crossed Altharis' face, but it vanished quickly. "You think you can offer me something my people cannot already obtain? Your race is young and fragile. You will not survive long in this galaxy." Eric met her gaze steadily. "I believe humanity has much to offer. We've faced many challenges, but we've always found a way to overcome them. Perhaps we can help each other." For a moment, there was silence. The queen regarded him with a calculating stare, her fingers tapping rhythmically on the armrest of her throne. It was clear she wasn't convinced. "You come to me asking for a trade agreement," she continued, her voice as sharp as a blade. "But I know the true purpose of your visit. You think that by offering us your technology, you will gain favor with my people, that we will see you as equals. But you are not equals, human." Eric's brow furrowed, but he didn't raise his voice. "We may not be equals, Your Majesty, but that doesn't mean we can't work together." The queen's lips curled into a bitter smile. "You are too naive. You know nothing of what it means to rule an empire, to carry the weight of a dying world on your shoulders. You come here with your simple offers and think you can fix everything. You cannot." Eric took a deep breath. He had been prepared for hostility, but not quite like this. "I understand that things are difficult for your people. I know that your planet is in decline, but perhaps—" "Perhaps," the queen's voice suddenly erupted in fury, her tone sharp enough to slice through the air. "You think you can save us? You think you can offer us solutions when we've already tried everything? Your kind is weak, human. You cannot understand the challenges we face." The room grew tense as Altharis stood from her throne, her towering form dominating the space. "You don't belong here. You should leave before you cause more harm." Eric stood tall, his resolve hardening. "I won't leave, Your Majesty. I'm here to help whether you accept it or not." The queen's eyes narrowed, and for a moment Eric thought she might strike him down where he stood. But instead she turned away, her back to him as she spoke in a softer tone, almost to herself. "Why don't you leave me alone, human?" The words cut through the room, but Eric stood his ground. "I'm here to stay," he said quietly, his voice unwavering. There was another long silence, the tension thick in the air. Then, with a sigh, the queen turned back to face him. Her expression was no longer one of fury, but something else, something unreadable. "You are a stubborn one," she muttered, almost as if speaking to herself. "You will not leave no matter what I say, will you?" Eric shook his head. "No, Your Majesty." I came here to help, and I'll do everything in my power to do so." The queen studied him for a long moment, and then, surprisingly, she sat back down on her throne, her expression softening ever so slightly. "Very well, human, let us see what you have to offer." It was the first step toward an unlikely alliance. Eric had no idea what the future would hold, but he knew one thing for certain: he wasn't going to give up. And despite her fierce demeanor, the queen wasn't going to get rid of him that easily. Captain Eric Carter spent the next few days moving through the grand halls of the Tzalkian palace, trying to understand a people whose ways were so different from his own. Queen Altharis had given him no special privileges, but she had also not thrown him out as she had threatened. Instead, he was allowed to stay in the guest chambers, deep inside the palace, surrounded by guards who watched his every move. The palace was massive, and every corner seemed to echo with history, but no matter how much Eric learned about the Empire's grandeur, it never masked the sense of decay that lingered. Despite the Queen's icy exterior, Eric couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to her story. Every time they crossed paths, he saw the burden she carried, something beyond her warrior spirit, something that made her more than just the ruler of a dying empire. She wore it in the set of her shoulders, in the tightness of her jaw, in the way her eyes seemed to hide behind the anger she let slip so easily. It was almost as if she were a volcano, constantly simmering beneath the surface, ready to erupt. The Queen had only spoken to him briefly since their first confrontation, but it was clear to Eric that her mind was working, constantly calculating, never resting. On the third day, as Eric wandered the palace grounds, he found himself at the edge of a garden that overlooked the desolate landscape of the Tzalkian world. It was a place of quiet solitude, the air thick with the scent of unfamiliar flowers, a stark contrast to the harshness of the world below. Altharis stood there, her long cloak flowing behind her, her arms crossed as she stared out over the horizon. For a moment, Eric hesitated, unsure whether to approach, but he had come here for more than just negotiations. He had come to understand this alien species, and more importantly, to understand their queen. He walked closer, and the sound of his footsteps on the gravel caught her attention. Without turning to face him, Altharis spoke, her voice soft but filled with the weight of her years. "Why are you still here, human?" Her tone was less harsh than before, but it was still tinged with the bitterness that always followed her words. "Do you not have a world to return to, a home to save?" Eric was used to the anger in her voice, but there was something different today. It felt tired, almost broken. "I have a world, yes," he said, stopping a few feet behind her. "But it's not about saving my world, it's about helping yours." She didn't respond immediately, and for a long moment, neither of them spoke. Eric could see the exhaustion in the Queen's posture, the way she carried herself as if the weight of the entire galaxy was placed on her shoulders. He wondered how many years she had fought to keep her people alive, how long she had worn the crown that seemed so heavy for her. Finally, Altharis spoke again, her voice quieter this time. "My people are dying, human. Our world is decaying, and no one has been able to fix it. We've tried everything, science, war, diplomacy, but nothing works. My people are fading, and I am powerless to stop it." Eric's heart sank. He had known that the Tzalkian Empire was in decline, but hearing it from their queen, seeing the vulnerability in her eyes, made it all too real. "I didn't come here to make empty promises," Eric said, his voice calm but filled with empathy. "I'm not here to fix everything. I'm here to help you try something new, something different. You don't have to face this alone." Altharis turned to face him then, her green eyes narrowed, her expression a mixture of doubt and disbelief. "And you think your people can save us? After everything we've done?" "After the mistakes we've made," Eric met her gaze with steady eyes. "I think your people are strong, I think they deserve a chance, and I think you deserve a chance too." For a moment, it seemed as though Altharis might laugh at him, might lash out as she had done before. But instead, something shifted in her expression. The anger in her eyes softened just a little, and Eric saw a flicker of something deeper, something buried for far too long. "I don't want pity, human," she said sharply, though it lacked the venom it once had. "I don't need your sympathy or your offers of help. My people will stand or fall on our own." "But you don't have to do it alone," Eric repeated, his voice steady. "You've carried this burden for so long, it doesn't have to be your fight alone anymore." The Queen looked away from him then, her gaze returning to the desolate landscape. Her fingers clenched at her sides, but she didn't speak for a long time. It was as though she were battling herself, struggling to come to terms with something she didn't want to admit. "I have no choice," she murmured, more to herself than to Eric. "I am their queen. I have to do what's best for them, even if it means making difficult decisions, even if it means losing myself in the process." Eric took a step forward, his voice low and sincere. "That's exactly why you need help, because you're carrying the weight of everything, your people, your planet. You can't keep carrying it on your own forever." Altharis turned her head slightly, her expression unreadable. "And what do you know about carrying the weight of a whole empire?" Eric paused, considering her question carefully. "I've lost people. I've seen what it's like to fight for something bigger than yourself, but I've also seen what it's like to fight alongside others. Together we're stronger." The Queen's eyes flickered with something, perhaps disbelief, perhaps curiosity, but whatever it was gone almost as quickly as it had appeared. "You speak as though you understand," she said, her voice hard again. "But you cannot begin to understand what it's like to lose everything, to watch your people wither and die, knowing that no matter what you do, nothing will ever be enough." Eric didn't answer her. He couldn't. Instead, he simply stood there, waiting. He understood the depth of her pain, the frustration of seeing her people's fate slip out of her hands. He didn't know what the future held, but he knew that Altharis wasn't just a ruler, she was a person, a being burdened by a loss too great to bear alone. Finally, the Queen spoke again, her voice a whisper. Maybe we could try, just for a little while. Maybe you can help me find a way out of this. But don't think that just because I let you stay, I trust you." "I don't need your trust," Eric said, his voice steady. "I just need a chance to show you that we're not so different. We both have something to fight for." Altharis didn't respond. Instead, she turned away from him, her posture stiff and proud, but her eyes distant, lost in thought. Eric knew that this was the beginning of something complicated, something dangerous, but also something filled with potential. As he watched the Queen retreat into the palace, Eric couldn't help but wonder if the Tzalkian Empire still had a chance. And if the Queen's heart, so hardened by years of loss, might finally begin to soften. In the days that followed, the situation on Tzalkia grew more complicated. Captain Eric Carter had been given more access to the inner workings of the Tzalkian Empire, although he still had to tread carefully. The Queen's trust was not easily earned, and Eric knew that. Every conversation felt like a delicate negotiation, where the wrong word could lead to disaster. Yet, despite the constant tension, something was beginning to shift. Queen Altharis had allowed him to stay longer than she initially planned. She had even begun to listen to his suggestions, albeit reluctantly. She had her reasons for suspicion, but Eric was determined to show her that humanity's willingness to collaborate was more than just a political move. It was a genuine offer of help. It wasn't long before Eric found himself at the heart of a larger, more dangerous issue. A faction within the Tzalkian Empire that had begun to stir unrest. It wasn't just the environmental decay of the planet that threatened the Empire. It was the political instability that came with it. The more Eric learned, the more he realized how fragile Altharis's rule was. While she ruled with an iron fist, her empire was like a house of cards, vulnerable to the smallest disruption. The first sign that something was wrong came in the form of whispers. Tzalkian soldiers, once proud and loyal, now moved with a sense of uncertainty. Altharis's closest advisors were acting strangely, their loyalty to her questioned by a growing underground movement. These were not just common soldiers. They were the elite warriors, the very heart of the Empire's military strength. And yet, they were beginning to turn their backs on their queen, questioning her decisions and fearing the inevitable collapse of their world. Eric had overheard a conversation between two of the palace guards in the hall one night. They spoke in hushed tones, but he could still catch bits of their words. "They say she's weak now, that she's too stubborn to face the truth," one of the guards muttered. "It's been years and nothing has changed." "Why are we still fighting to protect a planet that's dying?" the other replied. Eric's gut tightened. He knew that the Tzalkian Empire was in crisis, but hearing these words from the very soldiers who once swore allegiance to Altharis shook him. He couldn't stay silent. The situation was far worse than he had imagined. The next morning, Eric found himself summoned to the throne room. The atmosphere was thick with tension as he entered. Queen Altharis sat on her obsidian throne, her green eyes sharp and focused, but there was something different about her today. She seemed even more distant than the day before. You've been quiet, Eric said, stepping forward. What's going on? What have you heard? The queen's eyes flicked to him for a brief moment, but she didn't immediately respond. She gestured for him to sit, and Eric did, noting the subtle change in her demeanor. There was something about the way she carried herself today, something that hinted at a breaking point. There are whispers among my people, Altharis finally said, her voice low. Some are beginning to question my leadership. They say I've failed them. That I've led them down a path of no return. The planet is dying and they think I can't fix it. Eric studied her closely. He had expected this. He had seen it coming, but hearing the queen admit it so plainly hit harder than he anticipated. She was the ruler of an entire empire, yet here she was, confiding in him. The walls she had so carefully built were beginning to crumble. You're not the only one trying to find a solution, Eric said softly. I've seen the way you fight for your people. But you can't carry the weight of this alone. You need allies, not just warriors. Altharis's gaze hardened. You think I don't know that? She snapped, standing from her throne. You think I don't understand what's at stake? My people are dying, and all I've done is watch them wither. I am their queen. It is my duty to protect them, no matter the cost. But you don't have to do it alone, Eric pressed, rising to meet her. You can't, not with everything falling apart. There are things you haven't tried, things you might be too proud to consider. You're not weak for asking for help, Your Majesty. It takes strength to admit you need it. Her lips pressed into a tight line. Strength, she repeated, as if the word tasted bitter on her tongue. I have been strong. I have led this empire through wars and loss, through failure and grief. I have given everything to my people, and now they think I am weak. Eric could see the frustration, the deep pain she was carrying, and he couldn't help but feel a pang of sympathy. It was clear she wasn't just struggling with the planet's decay. She was struggling with the loss of her own people's faith in her. No matter how powerful she appeared on the outside, no matter how many battles she had won, the fear of losing her people was a wound she carried in silence. Sometimes, the strongest thing you can do is step back, Eric said, his voice gentle. You're so focused on saving them, but you're losing yourself in the process. If you keep pushing yourself too hard, you might not be able to save anyone. Altharis turned away, her gaze drifting out toward the dark skies. The storm clouds that once felt like a distant concern now felt even closer. They mirrored her inner turmoil, thick and foreboding. I don't know what else to do, she admitted, her voice quiet and vulnerable in a way Eric had never heard before. My people look to me, but I am no longer sure I have the answers. I've tried everything and nothing works. I don't even know if we can survive this. Eric stepped closer, his presence steady and grounding. You don't have to have all the answers, no one does. But you don't have to face this alone. Let me help you. Let humanity help you. Together we can find a way to turn things around. Altharis didn't respond right away. She stood still, staring out into the distance, lost in thought. Eric couldn't help but wonder what she was seeing. What battles, what losses, what choices had led her to this moment of doubt. Finally, she spoke again, her voice low but laced with a new kind of resolve. I will give you a chance, you and your people. But this cannot be about saving face or political gain. If we are to survive, it must be because we work together, because we put our differences aside and trust one another. Eric nodded, his heart lifting slightly. We'll do whatever it takes, together. There was a pause before Altharis spoke once more, her voice filled with a quiet intensity. The trust will come slowly, human. It will not be given freely. But I will give you this. I will let you work with my scientists, my advisors, and my warriors. If you can prove that humanity's solutions are more than just empty promises, I will consider taking the next step. But make no mistake, Eric Carter, I am not naive. You will have to earn my trust. Eric smiled slightly, the challenge clear in her words. I don't expect anything less. With that, they both stood in silence, the weight of their shared responsibility hanging heavy in the air. They were not yet allies, not yet friends, but they were no longer enemies. And in a world where empires fell and stars burned out, that small step might be the only chance they had left. The days that followed were filled with tension and uncertainty. Queen Altharis had agreed to let Eric work with her scientists, engineers, and military leaders, but there was no trust between them, at least not yet. Eric had no illusions about how hard it would be to prove himself to the Tzalkians. The Queen's skepticism was palpable. Each meeting, each attempt to collaborate, felt like walking on a razor's edge. One wrong word, one wrong decision, and the fragile alliance would shatter. Eric's days were filled with endless meetings. He worked closely with the Tzalkian scientists, attempting to find solutions for the planet's environmental collapse. They analyzed data, ran simulations, and debated potential strategies. But despite their efforts, nothing seemed to yield the breakthrough they were hoping for. The planet's atmosphere continued to deteriorate, the land grew more barren, and every solution they tried seemed to make the situation worse. One evening, after a long day of fruitless discussions, Eric stood on the balcony of his quarters, looking out at the distant horizon. The dark, roiling clouds above the Tzalkian capital mirrored the turmoil he felt inside. The queen had been distant for the past few days, her one-Scifi demeanor now almost unreadable. Eric couldn't help but wonder if she was beginning to lose hope, or if the weight of her empire's collapse was finally wearing her down. He hadn't spoken to her in hours, but he knew she was somewhere in the palace, working tirelessly to keep her people from falling apart. She had barely eaten or slept. The strain was starting to show. Her eyes, once sharp and filled with purpose, now seemed clouded by worry. Suddenly, the door to Eric's quarters slid open. He turned to see the queen standing in the doorway, her posture stiff, her face unreadable. She looked as though she had not rested in days. Her cloak billowed behind her, and her sharp green eyes gleamed with the same intensity they always did, but there was something more, something deeper in her gaze. "Eric," she said quietly, her voice low and strained. "We need to talk," he nodded, stepping away from the balcony and gesturing for her to sit. "Of course, Your Majesty. What's on your mind?" Altharis didn't sit. She simply walked further into the room, her gaze moving to the various maps and data screens on the walls. She seemed distant, as though her mind was elsewhere. "I've been thinking," she began, her voice cold but steady. "You came here offering help, offering solutions, but nothing we've done has worked. We're no closer to saving this world than we were when you first arrived. Every step forward leads to 2 steps back." Eric frowned. He had seen the frustration building in her, but hearing it so openly from her lips was different. It wasn't just the planet that was dying, it was her empire, her people. It was her own spirit that seemed to be faltering. "I know it's been difficult," Eric said, his voice steady, "but we're not giving up. I'm not giving up." The queen's eyes flickered to him for a moment, but she didn't respond immediately. Instead, she walked to the window, staring out at the swirling clouds. The silence stretched between them, thick and heavy, until she spoke again. "I can't afford to lose everything," she whispered, almost to herself. "I've already lost so much." Eric's heart tightened at the vulnerability in her voice. The powerful queen, the ruler of an entire empire, was not as invincible as she appeared. She was human, just like everyone else. She had fears, doubts, regrets, and the weight of her failure was beginning to break her. "You haven't lost everything," Eric said quietly, stepping closer. "You still have your people, you still have a chance to save them." Altharis turned to face him then, her eyes blazing with a mixture of anger and desperation. "You don't understand," she snapped. "I've been trying for years. I've done everything I could. I've sacrificed everything for my people, but nothing works. No matter how hard I try, no matter what I do, it's never enough." Eric stepped forward, his voice firm but gentle. "It's not just about fixing things, Your Majesty. It's about finding the right path. It's about working together. I've seen what you've done for your people. I've seen the strength you have. But you can't do this alone." She took a deep breath, her face contorting with frustration. "I don't have a choice," she said, her voice low. "I'm the queen. My people look to me for answers. I can't afford to show weakness. I can't afford to fail." "You're not weak for needing help," Eric said softly. "You're strong for asking for it." The words hung in the air between them, heavy and unresolved. Altharis didn't speak for a long time. She simply stood there, staring at Eric as though trying to gauge his sincerity. The silence stretched, and Eric waited, giving her the space she needed. Slowly, she seemed to relax, the tightness in her posture easing just a little. "I've always been told that strength means never showing vulnerability," Altharis said, her voice quieter now. "That I must always appear unbreakable, no matter the cost, but I don't know anymore. Maybe I've been wrong." Eric took a step closer, his voice soft but filled with conviction. "You're not alone, Your Majesty, and you don't have to be perfect. You're allowed to make mistakes. We all are, but it's not too late to change things. You can still save your people." Altharis's eyes softened just for a moment. But then, as quickly as it came, the vulnerability vanished, replaced by the cool, calculating demeanor she had worn for so long. She straightened her back and turned away, her face once again a mask of regal composure. "You're right," she said, her voice returning to its usual coldness. "But this is not about weakness or vulnerability. This is about survival. And if you want to help me, human, you will have to prove that your methods can actually work. I can't afford to waste any more time." Eric nodded. He understood. This wasn't about proving her wrong. It was about proving to her that there was still hope, still a way to save her people. It was going to be a long, hard journey, but they had no other choice. The stakes were too high. "Then let's prove it," Eric said, his voice steady. "We'll find a way together." Altharis turned to face him, her eyes meeting his once more. There was a flicker of something in her gaze, something that might have been trust, or maybe just the tiniest seed of hope. It was hard to say, but it was there, buried beneath the weight of everything she had endured. "Very well, human," she said, her voice softer than before. "Let's see what you're capable of." With that, she turned and walked toward the door, her steps steady and sure once more. Eric watched her leave, his heart heavy with the knowledge that the road ahead would be long and difficult. But at least now, there was a small spark of something that might just be enough to light the way. The weeks that followed felt like a whirlwind of progress and setbacks. Captain Eric Carter and Queen Altharis had formed an uneasy alliance, bound by the desperation of their situation. The Tzalkian Empire was teetering on the edge of collapse, and every day felt like a battle against time. But despite the mounting challenges, something between them was changing. They were no longer adversaries. There was respect now, unspoken but real. Eric had spent countless hours in the palace's laboratories and war rooms, working side by side with the Tzalkian scientists, trying to find a solution to the planet's dying atmosphere. Every attempt seemed to bring them closer to a breakthrough, only for it to falter at the last moment. The scientists' frustration was palpable, but Eric remained calm, determined to find a way forward. He had come here to help, and he wasn't about to give up. But it wasn't just the planet's failing ecosystem that Eric had to contend with. Queen Altharis was still struggling with the weight of her leadership, her empire's collapse hanging over her like a dark cloud. There were days when she seemed distant, lost in her own thoughts, and other days when her anger flared up without warning. Eric understood now that her fury wasn't just about the planet. It was about the responsibility she felt for every life in her empire, and the fear that she might not be able to save them. One night, after another fruitless meeting with the scientists, Eric found himself alone in the palace garden, staring up at the starless sky. The air was thick with humidity, the faint scent of alien flowers drifting in the breeze. He had been awake for days, the constant pressure of the mission wearing him down. But no matter how tired he was, he couldn't stop thinking about the Queen, about her struggle, about the pain that seemed to consume her. "Human," a voice called softly from the shadows, interrupting his thoughts. Eric turned to see Queen Altharis stepping out from behind a column, her cloak flowing around her like a dark shadow. She looked different tonight, softer somehow. Her eyes were still sharp, but there was a weariness in her gaze that Eric had never seen before. "Your Majesty," Eric said, standing up straight. "What brings you out here?" Altharis stepped closer, her footsteps almost silent on the stone path. She didn't immediately answer, instead stopping just a few feet away from him. The silence stretched between them, neither of them speaking, both of them caught in their own thoughts. Finally, Altharis spoke, her voice low and hesitant. "I've been thinking," she said, her tone soft but filled with an unexpected vulnerability. "About everything we've been through, about the things I've said, about how I've treated you." Eric's heart tightened. He wasn't sure where this was going, but the weight of her words felt different than anything she had said before. "You've been under a lot of pressure," Eric said quietly. "You don't need to apologize for that." She shook her head, a small gesture, but enough to show that she wasn't going to let herself off that easily. "I've pushed you away," she said, "because I thought I could do this on my own, because I thought if I showed any sign of weakness, I would lose everything. But maybe I was wrong." Eric didn't speak right away. He simply watched her, his heart heavy with the realization that Altharis had been carrying so much alone for so long. She wasn't just the ruler of an empire, she was a person with her own fears and regrets. "I've spent my life fighting to keep my people alive," she continued, her voice cracking slightly. "I've done things I'm not proud of, I've sacrificed too much, but in the end it feels like none of it matters, nothing has changed, I still can't save them." Eric took a step forward, his voice steady. You haven't given up, and that's what matters. You fought for your people every day, even when it seemed like there was no hope left. That's what makes you strong. Altharis looked at him, her eyes searching his face as if trying to understand him. Then, after a long pause, she spoke again, her voice barely above a whisper. I don't know if I can keep going, Eric. I don't know if I can do this anymore. Eric reached out, placing a hand gently on her shoulder. You don't have to do it alone. I'm here. Your people are here. We're all here working together. You're not alone. For a long moment, Altharis didn't respond. She simply stood there, her face turned away from him, the weight of everything pressing down on her shoulders. But then, slowly, almost imperceptibly, she nodded. Maybe we can do this, she said quietly. Maybe we can find a way to save this world, together. Eric's heart lifted at the words. It wasn't a promise, it wasn't a solution, but it was something. It was hope. The next morning, Eric and Altharis found themselves in the war room once again, surrounded by the T-Zalkian leadership. This time, however, the mood was different. The tension was still there, but it was tempered with a sense of resolve. The Queen had given her approval to proceed with a new plan, a plan that combined humanity's technological expertise with T-Zalkian ingenuity. They would attempt a last-ditch effort to stabilize the atmosphere using a series of complex machines that would, in theory, reverse some of the damage to the planet's ecosystem. Eric could see the doubt in the eyes of the T-Zalkian military leaders. They were skeptical. They had been burned too many times before. But Eric also saw something else, something that had been missing before. They were willing to try, and that was a start. For the next few days, Eric worked tirelessly alongside the T-Zalkian engineers, overseeing the construction of the devices that would hopefully turn the tide. The machines were intricate and delicate, their success depending on an exact combination of human technology and T-Zalkian materials. Eric had never worked on something so complex, but he threw himself into the task, determined to prove that this could work. Finally, the day arrived. The machines were ready. Altharis stood beside Eric, her posture as regal as ever, though there was a nervous tension in her shoulders that betrayed her anxiety. She had seen so many plans fail in the past. But this time she was allowing herself to believe. We have one shot at this, Eric said, his voice steady but filled with determination. If we get this right, we can save your world. Altharis nodded, her gaze fixed on the machines that now hummed with power. Then let's do it, she said, her voice hard but filled with resolve. Let's save my people. With a final glance at each other, Eric and Altharis gave the signal. The machines powered up, their systems coming to life. The air around them crackled with energy as the devices began their work. The ground beneath their feet trembled slightly, and for a moment it felt as though the entire planet was holding its breath. Minutes passed, then an hour. Slowly, the sky above them began to clear. The swirling clouds that had once covered the planet were starting to dissipate. It wasn't a miracle, but it was progress. The machines were working. The atmosphere was stabilizing. As the day wore on, the effects became more noticeable. The air grew cleaner. The temperature began to stabilize. And for the first time in years, the T-Zalkian people dared to believe that maybe, just maybe, they had a future. Altharis stood at the window of the palace, looking out at the planet below. The sky was clearer than it had been in years. For the first time in a long time, she allowed herself to feel hope. Eric stood beside her, watching her face as the tension slowly melted away. She was no longer the unyielding ruler who had once dismissed him. She was a leader who had allowed herself to trust again. And in doing so, she had found a way to save her people. Thank you, human, Altharis said quietly, her voice filled with gratitude. You were right, we didn't have to do it alone. Eric smiled, his heart light. No, your majesty, we didn't. And for the first time, both of them allowed themselves to believe in the future, not just for the T-Zalkian Empire, but for themselves.